Give it a test.
We're ready to go.
Is that close enough? You want it closer? Give it a 1, 2. Give it a
1, 2.
That's right.
At the end. But yes, my name is Cliff Whalen. I would like to introduce David Amram and Billy Koumantzelis, two friends of Kerouac, two very good friends of Kerouac. David Amram has composed more than 100 orchestral and chamber works, with many scores for Broadway and film. He's a wonderful musician and a very talented individual. And to his right is Billy Koumantzelis. Billy met Kerouac in 1962 in Lowell, and both Billy and David Amram remained friends with Kerouac until the end of his life. David Amram met Kerouac, in my opinion, at the peak of his creativity in 1956 and collaborated on many important projects. Billy Koumantzelis met Kerouac in '62 at a time when Kerouac desperately needed friends and was under a lot of pressure and was obviously in a lot of pain, physically, emotionally. So let me start off with a question for David. David, you met Jack Kerouac in 1956. In my opinion, Kerouac was at the peak of his creativity. It is now 56 years later. What was it about Kerouac which influenced you to be the person you are today?
Well, when I met Jack in 1956 at a Bring Your Own Bottle party in Manhattan, I was playing with Charles Mingus and working in the post office, and Jack had one book that was published, The Town and the City, which is a great book, but at that time was not that well known, and he was struggling. And I was at this Bring Your Own Bottle party, and this guy came up in a red and black checkered shirt and said, "Play for me." Then he handed me a piece of paper with something on it. Then he took it back before I could read it, and I had my French horn and penny whistles. There was no piano there, and I started playing, and right away I could just feel something. It was when I played with Mingus, which I was doing, and Monk, and all these great musicians, where the minute you started, something came to you and came out of you that you'd never experienced before. And I realized years later it was because he listened so intently and paid so much attention that it made it possible for me. I had no idea what he was doing, but it just told me what to do. And then he ran off and danced with someone, and over the period of time we began to bump into each other and do that more and more often. I found out he'd been a football player, I'd been a gym teacher, he spoke French at home. My mother had translated French and helped me while I flunked in school every year, so I finally learned to speak myself. He loved people. Just last week I was at the British Library in England, in London, and Jack used to recite Beowulf, Chaucer, and Charles Dickens, as well as Baudelaire, Céline, Rimbaud, and Voltaire in French. He was such a heavy, smart guy. And when I was just in England, I told him, you know, I remember 3 o'clock in the morning, he would not only sing the French folk songs like À la Clairefontaine and Un Canadien Errant, but also would recite Chaucer and Beowulf, even though I had no idea what Old English meant, and Charles Dickens. And here he was, all these years later, having his scroll, his original manuscript, in the same building as the original manuscript of Chaucer and Beowulf and Shakespeare and Charles Dickens. And I said, that's just where Jack belongs. Because I realized, as I got to know him, before On the Road came out, and before he became a famous person, he was a great, great writer, a great, great person. I never saw him disrespect or snub anybody or say a nasty thing about any other person. I said, man, this guy's a great role model for how to behave. And when he became a celebrity, he almost felt bad about that because he really wanted his own friends to do well. He cared about other people. I realized he was someone who was brought up in the church that actually believed in that and practiced that. He was a spiritual, wonderful, righteous person. And I saw in New York City, once he became a famous writer, he was supposed to put on a tweed coat, have a fake English accent, snub everybody, and become a real disrespectful, swinish type man of the year. And he couldn't do that. So a lot of the people in that literary world thought he was a traitor to his newfound class. And he remained himself. He remained for real, warm, understanding, and compassionate with every person, even in the final dark days when a lot of people abandoned him. He still had that beautiful way about him. He was a good influence on all of us. And his writing is so terrific that when we used to walk down 2nd Avenue after he became famous, and then the worst crime in America is to go out of fashion, as we all know. The hardest thing, aside from obscurity, is acceptance, because then you're supposed to become a different person. He didn't go for that. So I remember him saying, "Davy, I'm an author," as they say in Lowell, not an author. Author, he said, "I'm an author. Why don't they read my books? I'm an author." And I told the people in London that just 4 or 5 nights ago. And I said, now, right here in the British Museum, the center of the English language, he's definitely, with Shakespeare, Beowulf, and Charles Dickens, and all those other great cats, an author for sure.
Thank you very much. And Billy, you met him in 1962 at a party. At first, Billy didn't get along very well with Kerouac. At that party, it was a pretty interesting situation. Then they went to a house party after at the projects over near the North Common. After that, they ended up at the Sack Club all night. But over time, Kerouac came to Billy Koumantzelis' house many times, spent time with his children. He read Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. He oftentimes told them stories. So over time, Billy, you learned to really love Kerouac also, and you protected him. What made you love him so much?
Well, it's hard to say what I liked him or not, but I guess I liked him. He was a tough guy to really know, you know. He was an intellect, and he was anything you wanted him to be.
So so basically, he hung around with a lot of writers, musicians, artists. Like, what did you guys have in common? What was the thing that you guys talked about? Like, did he ever ask you for advice?
No, nothing in common. We were from Lowell, that's the only thing we had in common.
So basically,
We can't hear you, Bill.
We can't hear you.
Get in the mic.
so basically, I could ask questions all night, but I'm not going to. I'm going to open it up to people in the audience. If there's somebody that I have other questions. If you don't want to ask questions, fine. But is there anybody that has a question for either Billy or David?
Yeah, I have a question for Billy. There's a photo in Ricardo's Trattoria, and it shows you and Jack, and there's a woman in the photo also, but I guess she's been not identified. Do you happen to know who she is?
I haven't the slightest idea who she is.
Billy, is it true that, I mean, you know, you would escort Jack from bar to bar in Lowell and kind of look out for him?
Not really. We escorted one another, I think, at that time.
You did? Okay. All right. Just wondered.
Yeah, I listened. Billy has a CD out, by the way, and I found that interesting because you described the trip to New York City for the William Buckley show, and it's funny. You would think you guys were taking care of Kerouac, but at some point I realized basically you guys were all like you mentioned. You went to a restaurant and everybody was disheveled. So basically, you guys were all just watching out for each other, doing your thing, and having a good time, apparently.
I don't know if it was a good time or not, but you know, we were there.
Bill, did he ever take you to the Pawtucketville Social Club or the CCA or the Pastime?
I don't think the veteran will allow any grits in there, so I didn't go there.
And that's probably true, believe it or not.
David, did you work on Pull My Daisy with Jack? And what was that like?
Well, Pull My Daisy was the play that's now being done
Really?
right here in Lowell, finally.
Sure.
It was written in 1957,
Right.
but as they say in the higher intellectual circles of New York City's intelligentsia, what's the rush? So finally, all these years later, the play is being done, and about one teeny part of that play was what Jack decided the film was going to be about. He wanted to do what is now being done at the Merrimack Theater here, was actually supposed to be done as a film, but someone named Zuck Smith, fortunately long forgotten, made a movie called The Beat Generation, and they couldn't use that name. So Jack said, well, why don't we take this little story, a little tiny part of the play, when Jack's crazy friends came over, and he was living with Carolyn Cassidy and Neil Cassidy in California, and they're supposed to have a nice evening where a bishop and his wife and daughter
That's
were
the
going to
third
come
act
over
of the play, right?
and have a nice meal like people did in the suburbs of so-called normal society at that time. And all his disreputable friends came over and raised so much hassle. Finally, the bishop and his wife and daughter couldn't stand it anymore and left.
Yeah.
So I said, well, that sounds like a interesting idea. And Jack said, well, I'd like you to do the music for it. We have this song, Pull My Daisy. I said, great. He said, I want you to be in it. And I said, well, man, I'm not an actor. And none of us were actors to Pull My Daisy. If you come and see it this Sunday morning, we can prove that by our non-performances. But what Jack did that was so smart was he got all of his, Allen Ginsberg, Gregory Corso, to play themselves. Alice Neal, a great painter, she was playing the bishop's wife, but she was terrific. Richard Bellamy was an art dealer, and he played the bishop. Sally Gross, who was his daughter, in the play, was actually a dancer that was a friend of theirs. And the only professional actor was a wonderful actress who was married to Jack Youngerman, who only spoke French. And since it was a silent film, she didn't have to speak English. And she couldn't get any gigs in New York because there was no French-speaking theater in 1959 that had any jobs for anybody. So she was, Delphine Seyrig was her name. Years later, she was in a film called Last Year in Marienbad and became an international film star. And when I saw her, she said, Davey, that was my favorite role, being with you guys. You couldn't act, but you were so much fun. So what we did was we had Alfred Leslie, who was a wonderful painter, had a studio big enough to film, and he took washers out of his, like you use in a hardware store, and put them in the fuse box so he wouldn't blow out the wiring and the fuses, so there'd be enough light. And he was like a hostage negotiator. You got Gregory Corso, Allen Ginsberg, and all these people to say, now we're going to do something. And our way of acting was to see if we could make Robert Frank, who was the photographer, laugh so hard that he would shake his camera. So we did everything we weren't supposed to do for about 50 hours of stoned out, clowning, 3-week party, trashing Alfred's studio. And Robert Frank had a 16mm camera on a wooden tripod, but he was such a good still photographer. Somehow he made all this ridiculous stuff almost appear like that's what it was supposed to be. Then they had 50 hours edited down to 29 minutes. Jack came to one rehearsal and said, man, they're not following my script. And I said, well, Jack, they'll fix it when they edit it. That's the famous thing they tell you in the films. They'll fix it in the mix. So Jack came to see the massacring of his play, and he narrated, and I was there. The only time we ever used earphones, he said, just play for me. You could do the music later, but let's do it just like we're doing we did the first jazz poetry in New York, just like I was playing with Nomi, and I played with everybody all my life. You just listen and try to do what's right. He said, just play for me, and then we'll do something else. So we did that, and his narration was incredible. He made every single ridiculous thing seemed like it was supposed to be that way. And when you hear the narration of Pull My Daisy, that's so good you can close your eyes and skip the rest of it. And it's precious and beautiful. It's like what it was like to hang out with him. So when it was finally done, Alfred Leslie, the guy who directed, said, well, Jack, he said, that was a fantastic performance you did. He said, now I think we're getting close to it. I think it's to be more like Fellini and kind of emphasis. And Jack said, no, c'est fini. That means it's done in French. He said, let's celebrate. And instead of Gallo wine, we had Chateau Neuf de Pape. Jack started drinking that, and Alfred said, please, do it again. And Jack said, no, first time was the right time. Finally, he said, well, how can you possibly think you could do something like that at one time? And Jack said, because I'm touched by the hand of God. Now, about 40 years later, I worked with Alfred Leslie. I said, do you remember that? He said, of course I remember that. He said, everybody's touched by the hand of God. I said, yeah, but Jack didn't forget that. And the other thing that was so much fun was he also wanted me to appear in it. And I said, well, what's my character? He said, well, he says, Mez McGillicuddy. I said, what? And he said, just be you. So in the film, I'm Mez McGillicuddy, the deranged French horn player, which was typecasting. Larry Rivers, who was a painter that played the saxophone, more or less, was Neil Cassidy, but it was transferred to New York City, where the party didn't take place. And Neil didn't play the saxophone, but since Larry Rivers did Neil as a saxophone-playing train conductor, everybody else was themselves. And I noticed in the play, which I'm going to see for the first time, they actually have the character of Mez McGillicuddy as one of the characters. So 56 years later, or whatever, I'll finally find out what I was supposed to have done. But it was just something that happened spontaneously. It was a lot of fun. And now they show it at schools as a reflection of culture, or lack of culture, depending on who your teacher is, of the 1950s. It was really fun. And I think the beautiful thing about Pull My Daisy was the famous picture of all of us sitting in the diner. None of us looked like beatniks. None of us were snarling. None of us were nasty, stoned out type personalities that supposedly were supposed to be us, which I never knew until I read books about it. I never thought I was part of any beat generation or anything, except for borscht. I loved beet soup. That was about closest I got to anything beat. And the film just shows we were a bunch of people hanging out like each other's 12-step program to encourage each other, even with our day jobs, to hope someday we could be some kind of an artist, and we were just having a good time. That's why it's so nice to be back in Lowell, because that's what Lowell is. That's kind of a long answer, I'm sorry, but that's...
Great.
Can I have a couple of questions for Billy? Anybody out there have a question for Billy?
Billy, have you seen the play, and did you like it?
You mean last night?
Yes.
I wasn't too crazy about it, to be honest with you.
Another question for Billy?
Yeah, I'd like to ask you a question over here. Billy, you were pallbearer at Jack's funeral. Can you give us a recollection of what that was like those days at Jack's funeral?
Kind of interesting, because Jack was, I think he was laughing at all of us, because he was laying there in a polka dot jacket and polka dot shirt and whatnot, and he had a smile on his face, and he was saying, well, we need one of us idiots coming to see us. Anyway.
Billy, let me ask you a quick question. It's a little tricky question, and probably the answer could be no. You and I are both fathers. We can't imagine not accepting the children we have in our life. Did you and Jack ever talk about his daughter? That was a sensitive subject. Did it ever come up?
Never.
Never, huh?
Can I say something about my favorite Billy Koumantzelis story?
Sure.
There was a famous writer came up here, and he wanted to write, like many people, he wanted to write a book about Jack Kerouac. And I said, well, why don't you, if I may suggest, I said, I'm a visitor to Lowell for a long time, I love it, but I'm not from here. Why don't you speak to someone who is from here, that knew Jack, that grew up, that understands where he was coming from, what his whole life was about? And they said, well, who would you suggest? I said, Billy Koumantzelis. Billy's older brother was Jack's football buddy and a great athlete and a wonderful person, and he became great friends with Billy, who looked after Jack and showed him a lot of love when a lot of his old friends deserted him. Billy was always there for Jack. So he said, okay. So I remember he said to Billy, Billy, do you think that Maggie Cassidy and Town in the River and Dr. Sachs, all the Lowell books reflect his basic writing style, that his Lowell experience shaped him as a writer and a person? And Billy's response, who never minced words, was, one night he showed me some stuff, handed me some paper. He said, I read page or two, and I handed it back to him. And the guy who was the big-time writer looked shocked, and Billy said, frankly, it wasn't my cup of tea. and the guy looked horrible. But then Billy gave the greatest line. He said, but it didn't make any difference because we were buddies. And the writer turned to me and he said, this is no use to me. This has no literary value. I said, man, that's got more value than a 15,000-page essay, because it shows what kind of a person Jack Kerouac was and what kind of a person Billy was. And they had a friendship, and that was more important to him than having somebody tell him he was the world's greatest genius. It was beyond ego, professional, all that stuff. It was human. It shows here was somebody that remained human. He didn't get it, but Billy got it, and I think that was something I'll always remember. It was a beautiful, beautiful moment.
Yeah.
And we're going to end with that. We're going to end with that because we're out of time. We have a big program. Can we hear it from Billy and David?